books accessible for people that just want to listen. I am going to start reading some of the books I have, and so that way I can get my reading done and provide something into the world at the same time that's of use. So, today's book we are starting with The Idea, I guess this is flipped on this, The Idea of History by R.G. Collingwood. This is more of a work of philosophy than a work of history, according to the preface. Um, the point of this basically is to investigate what what is history? Why do we call it history? Literally right in the introduction. I love this. This book is an essay in the philosophy of history. The name philosophy of history was invented in the 18th century by Voltaire, who meant it by no more than critical or scientific history, a type of historical thinking in which the historian made up his mind for himself instead of repeating whatever stories he found in old books. The same name was used by Hegel and other writers at the end of the 18th century, but they gave it a different sense and regarded it as meaning simply universal or world history. A third use of the phrase is found in several 19th century positivists for whom philosophical the philo- philosophy of history was the discovery of general laws governing the course of the events which it was history's business to recount. The tasks imposed on the philosophy of history by Voltaire and Hegel could be discharged only by history itself, while the positivists were attempting to make out history not a philosophy, but an empirical science, like meteorology. In each of these instances, it was a conception of philosophy which governed the conception of the philosophy of history. For Voltaire, philosophy meant independent and critical thinking. For Hegel, it meant thinking about the world as a whole. For the 19th century positivism, it meant the discovery of uniform laws. My use of the term philosophy of history differs from all of these, and in order to explain what I understand by it, I will first say something of my conception of philosophy. Philosophy is reflective. The philosophy, the philosophizing mind never simply asks about an object. It always, while thinking about any object, thinks about its own thought about the object. Philosophy may thus be called the thought of the second degree, thought about thought. For example, to discover the distance of the Earth from the Sun is a task for thought of the first degree, which in this case, for astronomy, to discover what is exactly we are doing when we discover the distance of Earth from the Sun is a task for thought of the second degree, in this instance for logic or the theory of science. This is not to say that philosophy is the science of mind or psychology. Psychology is thought of the first degree. It treats the mind in just the same way in which biology treats life. It does not deal with the relation between thought and its object. It deals directly with thought as something quite separate from its object, something that simply happens in the world as a special kind of phenomenon, one that can be discussed by itself. Philosophy is never concerned with thought by itself, it is always concerned with its relation to its object, and is therefore concerned with the object just as much as is concerned with thought. This distinction between philosophy and psychology may be illustrated in the different attitudes adopted by these disciplines into historical thinking, which is a kind of special thinking that can be kind of special thinking concerned with the special kind of object, which will provisionally defined as the past. The psychologist may interest himself in historical thinking. He may analyze the particular kinds of mental events that go on in historians. He may, for example, argue that historians are people who build up a fantasy world, like artists, because they are too neurotic to live effectually in the actual world. But unlike artists, project this fantasy world into the past because they connect the origin of their neurosis with past events in their own childhood and always go back and back to the past in a vain attempt to disentangle these neuroses. This analyst might go into further detail and show the historian's interest in commanding the figure such as Julius Caesar, expresses his childish attitude to his father, and so on. I do not suggest that such analysis is a waste of time. I only describe a typical case of it in order to point out that it concentrates its attention exclusively on the subjective term and the original subject object relation. It attends to the historian's thought, not to its object, the past. The whole psychological analysis of historical thought would be exactly the same if there were no such thing as the past at all. If Julius Caesar was an imaginary character, and if history were not knowledge but pure fantasy. For the philosopher, the fact demanding attention is neither the past itself by itself, as it is for the historian, nor the historian's thought about it by itself, as it is for the psychologist. But the two things in their mutual relation, thought and its relation to its object, is not mere thought but knowledge. Thus, what is for psychology the theory of mere thought, of mental events in the abstraction of from any object, is for philosophy the theory of knowledge, where the psychologist asks himself, how do historians think? The philosopher asks himself, how do historians know? How do they come to apprehend the past? Conversely, it is the historian's business, not the philosopher's, to apprehend the past as a thing in itself. To say, for example, that so many years ago such and such events actually happened. The philosopher is concerned with these events not as things in themselves, but as things known to the historian. And to ask not what kind of events they were and when and where they took place, but what is it about them that makes it possible for historians to know about them? Thus, the philosopher has to think about the historian's mind, but in doing so, he's not duplicating the work of the psychologist. For him, the historian's thought is not a complex of mental phenomena, but a system of knowledge. He also thinks about the past, but not in such a way as to duplicate the work of the historian. For him, for the past, to him, it is not a series of events, but a system of things known. One might put this by saying that the philosopher, insofar as he thinks about the subjective side of history, is an epistemologist, and, and so far as he thinks about the objective side of a metaphysician, but that way of putting it would be dangerous as conveying a suggestion that epistemological and metaphysical parts of his work can be treated separately. This would be a mistake. Philosophy cannot separate the study of knowing from the study of what is known. This impossibility follows directly from the idea that of philosophy as thought of the second degree. If this is the general character of philosophical thinking, what do I mean when I qualify the term philosophy by adding of history? In what sense is there a special philosophy of history different from philosophy in general and from the philosophy of anything else? It is generally, though somewhat precariously, agreed that there are distinctions within the body of philosophy. Most people distinguish logic or theory of knowledge from ethics or from theory of action, although most of those who make this distinction would also agree that knowing is, in some sense, a kind of action, and that action, as it is studied by ethics, or at least involves, at least involves certain kinds of knowing. The thought of the thought which the logician studies is a thought which aims at the discovery of truth, and is thus an example of activity directed towards an end, and these are ethical conceptions. The action which the moral philosopher studies in is an action based on knowledge or belief to what is right or wrong, and knowledge or belief is an epistemological conception. Thus, logic and ethics are connected and indeed inseparable, although they are distinct. If there is a philosophy of history, it is it will no less immediately connected. It will be no less. intimately connected with the other special philosophical sciences, then these two are connected with each other. We have then to ask why the philosophy of history should be a subject of special study instead of being merged in a general theory of knowledge. Throughout the course of European civilization, people have in some degree thought historically, but we seldom reflect on the activities which we perform quite easily. It is only the difficulties which we encounter that force upon us a consciousness of our own efforts to overcome them. Thus, the subject matter of philosophy, as the organized and scientific development of self consciousness, depends from time to time on the special problems in which, at any given time, men find special difficulties. To look at the topics specially prominent in philosophy of any given people at any given period of their history is to find an indication of the special problems which they feel to be calling forth the whole energies of their minds. The peripheral or subsidiary topics will reveal the things about which they feel no special difficulty. Now, our philosophical tradition goes back in a continuous line to 6th century Greece, and at that time, the special problem of thought was the task of laying the foundations of mathematics. Greek philosophy, therefore, placed mathematics in the center of the picture, and when it discussed the theory of knowledge of it, understood by it first and foremost the theory of mathematics and mathematical knowledge. Since there have been, down to a century ago, two great constructive European ages of European history. In the Middle Ages, the central problems of thought were concerned with theology, and the problems of philosophy therefore arose out of reflection on theology and were concerned with the relation of God and man. From the 16th century to the 19th century, the main effort of thought was concerned with laying the foundations of natural science, and philosophy took its main theme of relation of the human mind as subject to the natural world of things around it in space as object. All this time, of course, people were also thinking historically, but the historical thought was always of a comparatively simple or even rudimentary kind. It raised no problems which it did not find easy to solve, and was never forced to reflect upon itself. But in the 18th century, people began thinking critically about history, as they had already learnt to think critically about the external world because history began to be regarded as a special form of thought, not quite like mathematics or theology or science. The result of this reflection was a theory of knowledge proceeding on the assumption that mathematics or theology or science or all three together could exhaust the problems of knowledge in general, was no longer satisfactory. Historical thought has an object with peculiarities of its own. The past, consisting of particular events in space and time which are no longer happening, cannot be apprehended by mathematical thinking, because mathematical thinking apprehends objects that have no special location in space and time, and it is just the lack of peculiar spatiotemporal location that makes them knowable. Nor can the past be apprehended through theological thinking, because the object of that kind of thinking is a single and infinite object, and historical events are finite and plural. Nor by scientific thinking, because truths which science discovers are known to be true by being found through observation and experiment exemplified in what we actually perceive, whereas the past has vanished and our ideas about it will never be verified as we verify our scientific hypothesis. Theories of knowledge designed to account for mathematical and theological and scientific knowledge thus do not touch on the special problems of historical knowledge. And if they offer themselves as complete accounts of knowledge, they actually imply that historical knowledge is impossible. This is This did not matter so long as historical knowledge had not yet obtruded itself on the consciousness of philosophers by encountering special difficulties in devising a special technique to meet them. But then what happened? as it did, roughly speaking, in the 19th century, the situation that current theories of knowledge were directed towards the special problems of science and inherited tradition based on study of mathematics and knowledge, whereas this new historical technique growing up on all sides was unaccounted for. A special inquiry was therefore needed whose task should be the study of this new problem or group of problems, the, the philosophical problems created by the existence of organized and systematized historical research. This new inquiry might justly claim the title of philosophy of history, and it is to this inquiry that the book is a contribution. Two stages are to be expected as the inquiry proceeds. Let's see what time it is because I got to get going to work at some point. Okay. First, the philosophy of history will have to be worked out, not indeed in a watertight compartment, for there are none in philosophy but in a relatively isolated condition, regarded as a special study of a special problem. The problem requires special treatment just because the traditional philosophies do not deal with it, and it requires to be isolated because it is a general rule that a philosophy does not assert, it denies. What what a philosophy does not assert, it denies, so that the traditional philosophies carry with them the implication that historical knowledge is impossible. The philosophy of history has therefore to leave them alone until it can build up an independent demonstration of how history is possible. The second stage will be to work out the connections between this new branch of philosophy and the old doctrines, traditional doctrines. Any addition to the body of philosophical ideas alters to some extent everything that there was already, and the establishment of a new philosophical science necessitates a revision of all of the old ones. For example, the establishment of modern natural science and of the philosophical theory that produced by reflection upon it reacted upon the established logic by producing a widespread discontent with the syllogistic logic and substituting for the new methodologies of Descartes and Bacon. The same thing reacted upon the theological metaphysics which the 17th century had inherited from the Middle Ages, and produced new conceptions of God, which we find an example in Descartes and Spinoza. Spinoza's God is the God of medieval theology as revised in the light of 17th century science. Thus, by the time of Spinoza, the philosophy of science was no longer a particular branch of philosophical investigation separate from the rest. It had permeated all the rest and produced a complete philosophy conceived all in a scientific spirit. Or, yeah. In the present case, this will mean a general overhauling of all philosophical questions in the light of the results reached by the philosoph I'm having a hard time right now. By the philosophy of history in the narrower sense. And this will produce a philosophy which will be a philosophy of history in the wide sense, i.e., a complete philosophy conceived from a historical point of view. These two stages, we must be content if this book represents the first. What I am attempting here is a philosophical inquiry into the nature of history regarded as a special type or form of knowledge with a special type of object, leaving aside for the present the further question how that inquiry will affect the other departments of philosophical study. What is history? This is little thing number 2. History's nature, object, method, and value. What is history? What is it about? How it proceeds and what it is for are questions which, to some extent, different people would answer in different ways. But in spite of differences, there's a large measure of agreement between the answers. And this agreement becomes closer if the answers are subjected to scrutiny, with a view to discarding those in which proceed from unqualified witnesses. History, like theology or natural science, is a special form of thought. If that is so, questions about the nature, object, method, and value of this form of thought must be first must be answered by persons having two qualifications. My voice is kind of giving out. First, they must have experience of that form of thought. They must be historians. In a sense, we are all historians nowadays. All educated persons have gone through a process of education which has included a certain amount of historical thinking. But this does not qualify them to give an opinion about nature, object, method, and value of historical thinking. For in the first place, the experience of historical thinking which they have thus acquired is probably very superficial, and the opinions based on it, therefore, no better grounded than a man's opinion on the French people based on a single weekend visit to Paris. In the second place, experience of anything whatever gained through the ordinary educational channels, as well as being superficial, is invariably out of date. Experience of historical thinking so gained is modeled on textbooks, and textbooks always describe not what is now being thought of by real life historians, but what was thought by real life historians at some point in the past when the raw material was being created out of which the textbook had been put together. And it is not only the results of historical thought which are out of date by the time they get to the textbook. It is also the principles of historical thought, that is, the ideas to, as to the nature, object, method, and value of historical thinking. In the third place, and connected with this, there is a peculiar illusion incidental to all knowledge acquired in the way of education, the illusion of finality. When a student is pupillari, in statu pupillari, with respect to any subject whatever, he has to believe that things are settled because the textbooks and his teachers regard them as settled. When he emerges from that state and goes on to studying the subject for himself and finds that nothing is settled, the dogmatism which was invariably a mark of immaturity drops away from him. He looks at the so called facts with a new eye and says to himself, "My teacher, the textbooks told me that such and such was true, but is it true? What reasons had they for thinking it true? And were these reasons adequate?" On the other hand, if he emerges from the status of pupil without continuing to pursue the subject, he never rids himself of this dogmatic attitude. And this makes him a person peculiarly unfitted to answer the questions I have mentioned. No one, for example, is likely to have answered them worse than an Oxford philosopher who, having read the greats in his youth, was was once a study of history and thinks that this youthful experience of historical thinking entitles him to say what history is, what it is about, how it proceeds, and what it is for. The second qualification for answering these questions is that a man should not only have experience of historical thinking, but should also have reflected upon that experience. He must be not only an historian, but a philosopher. And in particular, his philosophical thought must have included special attention to the problems of historical thought. Now it is possible to be quite a good historian, although an historian of the highest order, although not a historian of the highest order, without thus reflecting upon one's own historical thinking. It is even easier to be quite a good teacher of history, though not the very best kind of teacher, without such reflection. At the same time, it is important to remember that experience comes first and reflection on that experience second. Even the least reflexive historian has the first qualification. He possesses the experience on which to reflect. And when he is asked to reflect on it, his reflections have a good chance of being to the point. An historian who has never worked much at philosophy will probably answer our four questions in a more intelligent and valuable way than a philosopher who has never worked much in history. I shall therefore propound answers to my four questions as I think any present day historian would accept. Here they will be rough and ready answers, but they will serve for a provisional definition of our subject matter, and they will be defended and elaborated as arguments proceed. A. The definition of history. Every historian would agree, I think, that history is a kind of research or inquiry. What kind of inquiry it is, I do not ask yet. The point is that generically, it belongs to what we call the sciences, that is, the forms of thought whereby we ask questions and try to answer them. Science in general, it is important to realize, does not consist in collecting what we already know and arranging it in this or that kind of pattern. It consists in fastening upon something we do not know and trying to discover it. Playing patience with things we already know may be a useful means towards an end, but this is not the but it is not the end in itself. It is at best only the means. It is scientifically valuable only insofar as the new arrangement gives us the answer to a question we have already decided to ask. That is why all science begins from knowledge of our own ignorance. Not our own ignorance of everything, but our ignorance of something, of a definite thing. The, or, the origin of Parliament, the cause of cancer, the chemical composition of the sun, the way to make a pump work without muscular exertion on part of a man or a horse or some docile animal. Science is finding things out, and in that sense, history is a science. B. The object of science. One science of the object of history. One science differs from another in that it finds out things in a different kind, of a different kind. What kind of things does history find out? I answer, res gesti, actions of human beings that have been done in the past. Also, although this answer raises all kinds of further questions, many of which are controversial, still, however they may be answered, the answers do not discredit the proposition that history is the science of res gesti, the attempt to answer historical questions about human actions done in the past. How does history proceed? History proceeds by the interpretation of evidence. This is C. Interpretation of evidence. Where evidence is a collective name for things which singly are called documents, and a document is a thing existing here and now, of such a kind that historian, by thinking about it, can get answers to the questions he asks about the past. Here again, there are plenty of difficult questions to ask as to what characteristics of evidence are and how it is interpreted. But there is no need for us to raise them at this stage. However they are answered, historians will agree that historical procedure, or method, consists of essentially interpreting evidence. D. What is history for? This perhaps a harder question than the others. A man who answers it will have to reflect rather more widely than a man who answers the three we have answered already. He must reflect not only on historical thinking, but on other things as well. because to say that something is for something implies a distinction between A and B, where A is good for something and B that is for something which is good. Wait, is which B is that which something is good. But I will suggest an answer and express the opinion that no historian would reject it. Although the further questions to which it gives rise are numerous and difficult, my answer that history is for human self my answer is that history is for human self-knowledge. It is generally thought to be of importance to man and that he should know himself. Where knowing himself means knowing not his merely personal peculiarities, things that distinguish him from other men, but his nature as man. Knowing yourself meaning knowing first what it is to be a man. Secondly, knowing what it is to be a kind of man you are. Thirdly, knowing what it is to be the man you are and nobody else is. Knowing yourself what knowing what you can do. And since nobody knows what he can do until he tries, the only clue that a man can do is what a man has done. The value of history, then, is that it teaches us what man has done and thus what man is. And this is part 3 of the introduction. There's only a couple pages left, but I'm running out of time. So I'm going to have to end it here. Thank you all for staying for the reading. The first part of The Idea of History by R.G. Collingwood. We will start the rest of page 10 tomorrow.